Good morning, great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to talk a bit today about climate change and legal implications for UK pension schemes, which can sound like a bit of an esoteric topic, but hopefully as we draw it out, you'll see why it might be of interest generally. So I'll give a bit of a background about Client Earth and our work, an overview of how we think about climate change and how we see it creating financial risks that pension schemes need to be aware of. What we see as the legal implications of those risks and how that filters through, which might help frame some of the discussions later. And an example of how we see a number of pension funds now starting to take these risks into account and shifting their investment strategies to address them and help shift their finances into the new clean green economy. So a bit about Client Earth. So we're a non-profit environmental law organisation. We use the law, science and policy to tackle key environmental challenges. We work on climate change, energy, environmental justice, biodiversity, forests and human health as well. A number of years ago we also started a project which we refer to as our company and finance project. And the focus of this work is really to use the law to drive greater integration of climate change related financial risk factors into the management decisions of companies and investors. The aim of this work is to minimise the risks to the economy from climate change and to support a rapid shift of capital towards green investments. As part of this work over the last few years, we've been looking closely at the legal duties of actors across the pension sector to be considering and managing climate-related risks. So, I think climate change can be a bit of an abstract topic, so I think it's useful to ground it in science and just some general comments as well. Globally, greenhouse gas emissions are on the rise. As you can see from the graph, I won't go into the details, but that's sort of the consensus position is that greenhouse gas emissions are on the increase. And directly correlated with those greenhouse gas emission increases are increases in global temperatures. So this slide highlights the consensus position again from a range of meteorological organisations about the increasing temperatures that we see globally. And the key thing about this graph is that these temperature increases aren't projected to just stop here. They're also projected to increase dramatically over the course of the next century, with increases anywhere between 1.5 degrees C, which is at the bottom end of the potential range, and up to 6 degrees centigrade average global warming by the end of the century. As we've just heard, these have potentially enormous risks for society in general, and both the environment as well. And while we're already seeing the impacts of some of these changes, and some, I think, future escalation of these changes is at this point somewhat unavoidable, many of the worst risks can still be minimised and mitigated if urgent action is taken to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a range of different ways to sort of frame the climate change problem. You can think about it as a moral or an ethical issue, a justice issue, an environmental issue, an economic issue, and it's certainly all of those things. But one of the lenses that we've found really useful to talk about it is as a financial issue. And this has really helped us cut through a lot of the noise surrounding climate change related issues, particularly as far as investors are concerned. So what we're talking about here when we talk about climate change as a financial issue is that climate change is creating financial risks for companies and also the investors who invest in them. The most widely used taxonomy for these risks now is one that the Bank of England developed a few years ago, and they divide climate change impacts into physical risks, so that's sort of the obvious droughts, floods, storms, sea level rise, but they also highlight the transition risks, so the policy and regulatory responses, technology, changing behaviour by consumers and how that affects the real economy. To go into those in a few more details, I think the physical impacts we're already seeing now, you don't have to look much further than the record-setting hurricane season in the Atlantic this year to see that there are real costs associated with the escalating impacts of climate change, which scientists are now able to directly show the causal link between increased global warming and the increased severity of many of those storms. Just as an example, in the US this year, natural disasters It was their most expensive, costly year for natural disasters ever. In addition to those physical impacts, we also see a range of market impacts. So there's the policy and regulatory responses, largely now in line with the Paris Agreement, so countries around the world have agreed to tackle climate change, and they're really beginning to introduce policy measures to basically shift their economies. That can include emission standards on vehicles, carbon prices, and a range of other examples. We now see a number of countries, including China, India, UK, Norway, all saying that they're planning to rule out, basically make illegal combustion engines in the next 10 to 15 years in their countries. Alongside those government actions, we also see shifts in technology, so huge increases in renewable energy and battery storage and electric vehicles, and the costs for all of those things coming down very rapidly. We also see shifting social preferences and consumers exercising their power to choose to buy renewable energy or really changing how they consume and affecting the market that way as well. And the important thing with these impacts is they're not just confined to one area. They have the potential to cascade across all impacts of the economy. There's the risk of repricing of carbon-intensive assets, as we've already seen with many coal-fired power plants and utilities that rely on them. There's what's often referred to as stranded assets, the potential that these assets will no longer be financially viable. There's increases in energy price volatility, physical damage, and a range of other issues. So these financial impacts have impacts for companies at the firm level. So if you're an oil and gas company or an automobile or an auto company, then these changes potentially have direct impacts on your business. As an investor, if you're invested in those companies, obviously that then has flow-on effects to your investment as well. So all of that's basically to go to say that there are now clear links being made between the impacts of climate change, the responses that governments and the market are taking to address those changes, and the business and financial risks associated with those. And there's now been a wide range of industry players, regulators, and also lawyers now talking about how these financial impacts might actually follow through. So there's, large institutional investors are now really leading the way in talking about and quantifying what these risks might be for financial issues and the economy generally. The other thing I think it's important just to mention here, and is something we sometimes get a bit of pushback on, is that climate change can still be somewhat of a divisive issue in some parts of the world, and many, particularly in the finance sector, are now really making the point that it's not an issue about individual conviction. So as you can see there, the top quote from Andrew Bessie, who's the CEO of AGL, which is a large power company. It's irrelevant what I believe. If markets believe it, if customers believe it, if investors believe it, if government is making policy, then what I have is a significant risk in my portfolio that I have to mitigate. So company and industry are now seeing these issues as real risks to their business and risks to their investments. So, all that being said, what does this mean for pension funds? I won't go too deeply into the specifics of what the law requires, but just to give you a general overview, I think it's useful to have a starting point. Basically, the broad idea is that when making investment decisions or decisions about how pension funds are managed generally, trustees or managers of pension schemes in the UK, they have clear duties to act in the best interests of their beneficiaries, so the people who hold the pensions. This is often what's referred to as forming part of trustees' fiduciary duties. And it's now specifically required in pensions legislation in the UK. And once upon a time, the idea of fiduciary duty has often been used to push back on the idea that pension funds should be taking into account environmental and social issues when they're making investment decisions. But with the changes in how environmental and social issues are perceived, not just as an ethical issue, but now as a material financial issue, this has been flipped on its head. So now to act in the best interests of members and to earn as much money as possible from the fund, there's a recognition that those environmental and social issues, and particularly climate change, now need to be taken into account in the investment process. So that's now been clarified by the Law Commission, which is the quote you can see up there. Basically, it's the idea that where managers or trustees think environmental or social issues are financially material, then they have to take them into account in their investment decisions. To clarify this point a bit further in terms of what it means for climate change, over the course of the last couple of years we've been working with pension fund members to help them write to their pension schemes and ask them what they're doing about climate change and its impacts on their pensions. And as part of that, we have also commissioned a legal opinion by the two leading barristers. And they provided a view that, as you can see up there, if the risks associated with climate change are financially material to a particular investment decision, then they think it's clear, beyond reasonable argument, that the law permits and requires the trustees to take those risks into account when they're making their investment decisions. So basically, on the strength of this opinion, we believe that if the issue of climate change is raised with trustees or managers of pension funds, then unless they view the issue as entirely fanciful, which we believe the evidence now shows is no longer a reasonable position, then they need to turn their minds to whether or not it's financially material, and then take steps to actively address that in how they're making their decisions. One further point that is also worth making is that trustees and managers of pension funds are also permitted to take into account non-financial factors when they're making investment decisions. And they're allowed to do so where they have good reason to think that scheme members share their concerns and where there is no significant financial detriment to the fund. I think this is one thing particularly worth taking into account for people wanting to advocate for their pension funds to address these issues directly, where they want to go beyond just the financial arguments. There are still tools available for people to raise broader issues if they think other members of the scheme will share their views and have taken active steps to make sure that those opinions have been expressed and confirmed. There are also a range of new regulatory changes likely to come into effect in the next couple of years, which will make it easier and simpler for trustees and managers of pension funds to ask their members' views about social and ethical issues. So definitely something that's likely to be developing more into the future. I guess that's my point. The pensions regulators are also now starting to get to grips with these issues. So it's not just industry, well, I guess it's the regulators being pushed by industry who really want clarity on these issues. So the pensions regulator recently has said that they expect pension scheme trustees and managers to now assess the materiality of a range of factors, sustainability factors, including climate change, and to allow for them accordingly when they're developing their investment strategy. So the pensions regulators now made very clear what its expectations are as well, and the other financial regulators are also starting to come up to speed on this as well. So just briefly a few comments on the investment strategies to address these issues that we now see being adopted. There's increasingly a wide range of very sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated approaches that people are taking to address these issues. The top one up there is divestment. So some schemes are increasingly excluding some investments from their portfolios. Typically that's been coal companies, so they've decided that coal is too risky for them to have in their investment portfolio and have excluded that from what the universe of stocks that they invest in or assets they invest in. Increasingly we also see oil and gas and other fossil fuels falling under that banner as well. There are other options around risk management, so short of divesting or excluding assets entirely, there's a range of examples now where we see trustees and managers taking a risk management approach. So they often use metrics, so they do a carbon footprint of their portfolio, or they conduct scenario analysis to consider how their investment portfolio might fare under different scenarios of climate change into the future. And they also often increasingly use a range of sort of sophisticated approaches to tilting their portfolios, particularly passive invested portfolios, so that they are underexposed to particular sectors and overexposed to other ones in line with what they see as the potential risks. The other important point to realise is that climate change isn't just about risks and doom and gloom, it's also creating a huge number of opportunities. And we see these most obviously in sort of the renewable energy sector, energy efficiency sectors, and the range of different initiatives now taking place to really take advantage of the low carbon transition. Something that I've heard Lord Nicholas Stern describe a number of times recently as the growth story of the 21st century. So if companies and investors want to take advantage of these issues, and that's very much the language that appeals to them, then that's, there's at least opportunities there that need to be pointed out and seized as well. Finally, there's the active ownership, which is another important issue to keep in mind. So rather than divesting stocks from a company or excluding a company from a portfolio, what we increasingly see is a lot of investors using their power as shareholders in companies to advocate with those companies around how they're behaving. So really using their power as investors to engage with companies like Shell and BP and demand information from them about how they're realigning their business to deal with these issues and what they see as their future in a 2 degree or well below 2 degree world. How am I doing? In terms of what's really happening now, there's a range of pension schemes that are now adopting these issues and adopting a range of different approaches to deal with them. There's just a small list of examples up there. HSBC is a very prominent corporate pension scheme which has done a lot of work to spearhead and now has its default fund in what it calls its climate aware fund, and so that everybody in the HSBC pension fund is now automatically enrolled in a default option that tilts their investments away from carbon, CO2 intensive industries and into renewable energy efficiency stocks and that sort of thing. The Environment Agency Pension Fund has done a lot of great work spearheading what it might look like for a pension fund to be addressing climate change, and they have a very clear statement that they see, they invest as though the world was going to be on track for a 2 degree pathway, and that's how they've very deliberately positioned themselves, and that's the investment belief that they've taken at a very high level, and that then filters down to all of how they appoint the managers who actually manage the investments, as well as how they allocate their assets between different asset classes. There's a range of other examples there. I think there's a huge amount of momentum building behind this at the moment, and more pension funds are taking these risks seriously and also trying to take the opportunities both to act in their members' best interests, but also because they see the potential outcomes of this. So that's sort of a broad overview, and I can sort of go into more detail on a couple of issues later if it's useful. But I guess the key takeaways that I want to leave you with is that trustees and managers of UK pension schemes have clear legal duties to consider and manage financial risks to the scheme. There is now clear evidence that climate change is a real material financial risk, and there are now a variety of options that exist for managing those risks. So the do-nothing response is now largely it's disappearing out the window very quickly. So hopefully that's a useful background and can help frame some of the discussions as we go on.